Thank you for joining us, Professor Brewster. I would like to start with the recent book you have co-edited, the Handbook of Research on Comparative Human Resource Management. Why is such an analysis? Why is a comparative analysis of human resource management needed? What does it add to the current debate?
We looked around at what was going on, myself and Wolfgang Meyerhofer, the other editor, and there's a lot of stuff on human resource management and a lot of stuff on international human resource management as well. But what's interesting about that is a lot of it talks from the perspective that there is a best way of managing human resources as if that will work anywhere in the world. And we don't believe that. We think that people are managed differently and should be managed differently in different countries, and that different results will occur in different countries if you try to do things exactly the same way. So we tried to put a book together which explored those issues. There are, as you know, these theories of globalization. People will tell you, I've done this myself, you know, you go to the Forbidden City in Beijing and there's a McDonald's. And when you look around you see people wearing blue jeans and trainers and you say, gosh, the world is getting very similar everywhere. But in fact, of course, that's very superficial. In fact, the reality is that there are fundamental differences between the way things work in China and the way they work in Europe. And even within Europe, there are very fundamental differences about the way different countries do things. And we were concerned that that idea of globalization is leading to the idea that there is a best way to manage people which will work everywhere in the world. We just don't think that's true. We understand, of course, that companies want to have common policies throughout the world as far as they can. But we also know that on a day-to-day basis, companies are always trying to deal with this dilemma of what they can have as a global policy and what they have to have a bit differently in each country.
So, in terms of how the HR function in the company, how do you think the globalization has to globalize and localize?
Yes, all companies all the time are dealing with the issue of how much can we globalize, how much can we make everybody do more or less the same thing, and how much do we have to adapt to the local environment. It's not something companies have a choice about. They have to do both of these things at once, and that's very difficult. And you can see, I mean, there's lots and lots of examples of this, but if you think about something like diversity policies, you know, diversity policies in the United States of America mean that you pretty much have to recruit more or less the same proportion of women and of black people as there are in the local community. So if you're down on those, then the next people you recruit have to be from some of those groups. Now, you know, we also take diversity very seriously in Europe, but if you deliberately target groups, that's against the law in Europe. You're not allowed to do that. So the same policy leads you to entirely different conclusions. And then if you start thinking about what would you do in Saudi Arabia, you know, or some other countries, clearly the same thing is not going to work in all these environments.
But do you think that this trade-off is stronger? So, for example, in Europe?
I think those organisations that are based in Europe tend to be rather more aware of these differences, because in most countries in Europe, if you get in your car and drive for an hour, you could be in 3 other countries. So we're very conscious of, you know, cultural differences and institutional differences. I think if you come from Japan or China or the United States, where you can drive for hours and hours and you're still in the same country, you're probably much less aware of those kind of distinctivenesses between countries. And therefore there's probably a tendency on the part of those organisations to try to impose more headquarters practices on their subsidiaries.
But to go back to the two things that you mentioned earlier, culture and institutions.
Yes.
What do you think? What's the weight of culture and institution in terms of importance? How a company can actually, say, an European company, a UK-based company that moves to China, in terms of how could a company can actually try to deal with culture, local culture, and institutions as well?
Yeah. Well, some of those things you can control. For example, if a British company moves to People's Republic of China or opens a subsidiary in the People's Republic of China, they don't have to recruit typically Chinese people. They can deliberately select Chinese people who have more British characteristics. So it's quite possible to find Chinese people who are perhaps more entrepreneurial, who are more prepared to take individual responsibility. Cultures are normal distribution curves, so there's always people who are not exactly the norm. So culture you can do something about. The institutions are much more difficult to do things about. You get the employers' associations lobbying the European Union about legislation and so on. So some of it you can do something about. But the kind of education system in the country, the social security system, the tax system, the employment system, how people change jobs and those kind of things, the trade unions, there's lots of things it's very, very difficult for employers to do anything about. So if you ask me what's the balance between culture and institutions, I'd say both are important. And they're both connected as well. But culture is more within an employer's capacity to do something about. Mm-hmm. Institutions, it's very difficult to change. If you go to Finland, where nearly everybody is in the trade union, yes, you can set up a non-union company or a non-union subsidiary, but you're not going to become a real legitimate player in that country, and you're not going to get government contracts, and all sorts of things are not going to happen to you if you try to break away from the institutional base.
Do you see the future of society converging or diverging?
Well, Wolfgang Meyerhofer and myself have done, yes, we've done a lot of research, because we have now more than 20 years data going back 20 years. Looking at human resource management within Europe. And there's an argument that within Europe, not only have you got the general trends of globalization, but you've also got the unifying factor of the European Union and the various directives and legislation and so on that comes from the European Union. So we looked within the European Union, and what we found were there were some very clear trends. We could see the same things going on in most countries most of the time. And when I say most of the time, I don't mean 50% plus one, I mean 2/3 or 3/4 of the time we could see these trends. So very clear trends, but equally all of the countries at the end of the 20 years were still just as different as they were at the beginning of the 20 years. So, for example, if you think about something like trade union membership, we know that in most countries, not exactly all, but a vast majority of countries, trade union membership is declining. And it has been declining over that 20-year period. But the reality is that still in Finland most people are in the trade union, and in France hardly anybody is. And that's pretty much what it was 20 years ago, and that's what it is now. They've both been declining, but they're still quite different at the end of the 20 years. So I think there are common trends, but I don't see any real sign of countries becoming more alike in the way that they manage their people.
But then from an institutional point of view, have the EU and all the EU directives?
Well, I think what it tells you is maybe that the EU directives are not being equally applied in all of the countries. So I think what you generally see, and I think there's some research from the European Commission about this, but I'm not really sure. But what you generally see is that the northern European countries fight most regulations very hard, but then when they are passed, they tend to enforce them. The southern European countries don't fight very hard, but when they're passed, they generally ignore them. And that's partly because of the structure of employment in these countries. So in southern Europe, most employment, you've got a significant part of employment, of course, in the government-owned sector, but most of the other employment is in family-run businesses. And it's obviously much more difficult to enforce regulation in small and medium-sized, even large-sized family-run businesses compared to stock market quoted companies where there's a lot of individuals looking in and peering in at the results and at what the companies do and examining them in great detail. So I'm afraid the homogenising effects of the European Union have not been that great. The Italians are still very Italian, the British are still very British, the French are still very French, and so on and so forth. And that applies to the way they manage their people too.
So this is
subsidiaries of multinational corporations don't do exactly what local companies do. They tend to be a little bit different, so they're bringing in different practices into each country, but not that different. I mean, in most cases, subsidiaries of multinationals tend to do pretty much what the local companies do. I mean, they're dealing with the same laws, the same labour market, the same financial constraints and the same fiscal situation, so it's not really a surprise. So it'll be interesting to see over the next few years, I think, the effect that multinationals have. Does that increase in times of crisis, or does it reduce? It'll be very interesting to see in some of the southern European countries which are in deep economic problems, whether the influence of multinationals will become more significant, because arguably the external banks and the external governments are having more influence in those countries, so maybe external companies will have more influence in those countries as well. So that will be a very interesting thing to see. At the moment, I think it's all very uncertain. We don't really know what the future is going to hold. Companies from the USA generally struggle a little bit more to understand the local environment and to be aware that the things that work in Milwaukee won't work in Modena. They find that quite a difficult thing to understand. Whereas I think European-based multinationals just kind of assume that that's going to be the way, because we just know that. I mean, most people running multinationals, I can't believe there's anybody running any multinational in Europe who hasn't spent a lot of time in another European country, if only just on holiday. Whereas there are many people running American multinationals who've never been out of the United States of America. So I think European companies are much more aware of the need to adjust, and what you often find is that there is more tension within the American multinationals. So the local managers spend quite a lot of time justifying themselves and justifying to headquarters in the USA why they're not doing exactly what the policy says. Whereas I think for European multinationals it's quite okay to say, look, you don't realise, but here in Poland it's a different situation. If we try to do the same thing, it won't work the same way. It'll have a different consequence. So we're doing a slightly different thing in order to get to the same objective that you're trying to get us to reach. And I think that's more accepted in the European multinational corporations. cooperation. In most of the countries, I mean, certainly most European countries, there are always hugely successful international organisations. You know, you might say the Italian economy or the Spanish economy are really struggling at the moment, but there are some phenomenally successful companies from Italy and from Spain who are dominating the world in their field. They must be doing something right, and I'm pretty sure it's not trying to behave like the Americans or behave like the Japanese. It's something in their own style that fits their organisation and the way that they work, and has been very successful. And I keep talking when I'm discussing these issues with company specialists. I keep saying, why do you want to reach this kind of global standard? Why don't you think much more about what's been successful for you as a German company, a Swedish company, a French company, whatever it may be, and build on that, because that's obviously your unique selling proposition. But you know, a lot of people want to chase this global style somehow.
I would like to conclude by asking you like a final question. So what's the key factor for a successful HR function?
I think for HR functions, I think... Can I give you two key functions, key issues rather than one? I think there are two things which companies have to have. One is awareness. I mean, I think the whole point of of looking at comparative human resource management is that it's very difficult for people to understand human resource management in other countries. I mean, I have trouble after 45 years understanding human resource management in the UK, and the only way I can do it with other countries is by working with colleagues in those countries. Multinational companies have those skills. They have their own people in the various countries, and they really need to listen to them a lot more and spend much less time policing their activities and much more listening to what is specific and is special about their context and adapting things to that circumstance. So awareness is one issue. Second thing I think is the understanding that human resource management is a critical part of the management process. We know, for example, that in nearly all organisations, the cost of labour is the single largest element of operating costs. So if you're going to run your business efficiently, you better have cost-effective human resource management. We also know that the only resource you've got, which is going to be able to make use of the other resources, the heating, the lighting, the equipment, the services, the raw materials, the logistical networks, the only way they're going to work is if the people work properly. So on both the costs and the benefits side, getting cost-effective human resource management is critical. So I think awareness of the differences and awareness of the importance of human resource management, so that it's not left as a sort of downstream activity after we've taken the key strategic decisions, but is increasingly brought into the foreground whilst we're taking those decisions, and we think about that at the same time.
Thank you very much, Professor Brewster.
My pleasure.
Thank you.